Hi, so this is going to be a little overview on comic books, graphic novels, and something called graphic fiction. I wanted to do this because this term might seem weird to you, and it might be kind of weird to talk about comic books in a literature course. So I want to kind of go over the history of them and how they became part of the canon of literature, something that we study. So before I do that, let me give you my bona fides. I'm terrible with French words. As a comic book connoisseur, to sort of let you know that I do actually know what I'm talking about in this particular field. So hold on, come with me with just for a moment. All right. Okay. So I don't know if you can see this here, but I got some Silver Age Spider-Man. I got a little Spider-Man pop over here. I have some other comic books from the Silver Age at home. These are just the two that I keep in my office because I have nowhere to properly display them at home. That is not something that I'm particularly allowed to do. Anyway, enough about me. Why are we looking at comic books in a class? Well, to understand this, you need to kind of look at the history of comic books just for a little bit. So, if we look at comic books as a sort of medium, there's three main areas, four actually, but the fourth one actually doesn't really come into play as much. So the first one is the Golden Age. Golden Age is like dominated by Superman. This is, the golden age of comic books where they all begin, basically, right? Superheroes basically defined the genre at the time, so you get Superman, Batman, all these superheroes. After a while, comic book superheroes kind of die out. That's in the 50s. In the 50s, you get a lot of horror books, EC, which makes something called Tales from the Crypt, which you might know, and a bunch of other knockoff horror books. There's a lot of combat books, like Combat Casey, which was published by Atlas, which was Marvel before it was Marvel. And there's a bunch of other type of those books. Howling Commandos, I think, was at this time too. Anyway, the only reason I bring this up is that the 50s kind of changed. They got more adult. That was particularly, I think, from the influx of veterans of World War II reading comic books, because that's something that they got a lot of. Anyway, a lot happened and changed in the 50s in terms of how they censored comics, and I can't go into that because it's a long story, but let's just say that by the end of the late 50s, comics books were heavily censored by something called the Comic Book Code. Now we start to move into the nuclear Silver Age, right? The reason I call it the nuclear age is that everyone gets their powers from nuclear power. Spider-Man, Hulk, you name them. Anyways, Silver Age is really interesting. It's my personal favorite era of comics. It's pretty much the beginning 60s. Technically I think it starts in the late 50s, but it really kind of gets into swing around 61, 62, 63. That's really dominated by Marvel. They were created basically in this time period. Marvel was publishing books way before this for a long time, but they were always like second and third fiddle to DC. Now Marvel became the powerhouse that we know it to be today. The reason that is that you have all these great comic books coming out, one being Spider-Man, my particular favorite. The reason why Spider-Man was so popular was because he was just so different. So you think of Superman, he's a god, right? He can do anything he wants. He's from another planet. He comes here. He is not one of us. He is above us, right? It's hard to connect with that in a way. Whereas in Spider-Man, he was a teenager. He worries about his aunt. He worries about money all the time. He's a totally different comic book character that we know of. He's living in the outskirts of New York. He's not living in Manhattan, Gotham or something. He's not living in somewhere glamorous. He's living in basically like the suburbs of New York, so to speak, at that time, right? Don't ask me how he got from his house to Manhattan in the time he does. That's just a Spider-Man trick. Anyway, why am I bringing this up? Well, the 60s really changed comic books. Alan Moore, who's going to play a big part in why graphic novels became graphic novels in the 80s, was kind of inspired by the Ditko Lee era of Spider-Man, because it was just like, wow, you can do this, like it's everyday problems, and that it made comic book heroes more grounded, right? So before, in the golden age, comic book heroes weren't necessarily grounded, especially if you see some of those Supermans from the 40s and 50s with Crypto, his dog, right? Anyway, so the Silver Age kind of grounded superheroes, and so we get to the Bronze Age, which is kind of the 70s up until the 80s, and this is where graphic novels start to come into play. So what starts to happen is that you get these indie people making comics, and they're subversive. Mouse, which is part of the readings this week, that's the Spiegelman one, totally revolutionized what comics could be. This is a comic about the Holocaust, about his father in the Holocaust. It's not something that anyone had ever seen. It won tons of awards, much critical acclaim, and people started thinking like, hey, wait a minute, comic books could actually be literature, right? Like that's not a crazy thing to think. So Mouse was really one of the books that kind of broke that door down. And if you, after that, in the 80s, you had the publishers, like the big publishers like DC, Marvel, kind of thinking like, hey, you know what? Maybe we can start kind of collecting these books together so that we can, get some of that prestige that people like Mouse and got. So you start seeing them collect books. Another reason I think too that they started doing this, it's a cash grab, because so for example, let's take Watchmen, which is one of the biggest reasons why we have something called graphic novels now. When it was published in 12 issues, and so if you're a person trying to read Watchmen, you have to get all the issues, and if you miss an issue, you missed it, right? So what they would do is afterward, collect them into a book. And so in order to sound a little bit more fancy, they didn't just say comic books in a book, like a book of comic books. They called it something like a graphic novel. And so we got to elevate it a little bit if we want to make sure into literature. I remember having a discussion once in one of my grad seminar classes where the teacher called them graphic novels, and I was like, time out. I don't like that term, because I really think it's kind of a, excuse my French, BS term. It's just something that was kind of made up in order to collect and sell books. They're comic books, and, it doesn't hurt them to say it that way, and so that even the term graphic fiction, graphic novels, I hate to go against the textbook on this one, but, just, we call them comic books, that's what they are. And I don't think it's demeaning to them. As someone who loves them greatly, you can still appreciate them. You don't have to give them this kind of false name. Once they get into a textbook, all of a sudden we're calling them a different name, right? Anyway, tangent stopped. 80s were when graphic novels really began, because they started realizing, hey, like we can start to, all these issues that previously would go we wouldn't get any money from them. Like we'd print this issue and this issue, and then that's it. That's the revenue stream's gone. They started realizing we could package them together, call them a graphic novel, and sell them. Marvel did this a lot. They didn't necessarily call all of them graphic novels, only in the ones that had like a unified or cohesive story. The X-Men, I'm blanking the name of it. I forget. I think it's called Man Kills, God Loves. That's one of the first X-Men graphic novels where it was just kind of, put together as one story. Watchmen, another one that I talked about, mentioned earlier, and I think I have it somewhere. But Watchmen was a huge sort of hit in the 80s, and it really sort of revolutionized what comic books could be. And so that because of this, you have this sort of boom of graphic novels. And then, the mainstream attention to things like Watchmen really got a lot of these indie publishers some more spotlight. So like something like Persepolis, that sort of gets, rising tide lifts all boats. That you get people, wanting to read graphic novels now because they're a thing, that they're used to them, that, they don't have to buy individual issues. You also pull in people who might not want to collect individual issues, like me nowadays. Like I only read graphic novels because I don't really have time to collect single issues anymore. And so you're getting in a whole new audience. And because of this, and in the 80s, everything became even more grounded, where, like I mentioned earlier, Spider-Man really did that in the 60s, and then Alan Moore with Watchmen really grounded it in the 80s in terms of really trying to make it be like, what would it be like if these people really existed? The Dark Knight Returns is another one that really kind of pushed graphic novels, where it was kind of written almost as a graphic novel, but still first published as comic books and then collected once it was done. But, at this time, it was really the 80s where graphic novels became a thing, right? And so after that, they started becoming taken seriously in the field of literature, where, when I started to go into college around 2001, I had professors who would, use graphic novels and teach them. That's where I first found about things like Maus. I had a English professor who knew I loved comic books and was like, hey, have you ever read this? And I was like blown away by it. And so that by the early 2000s, comic books have become part of, the canon. That doesn't mean that they're totally accepted, I would say, or that they're a big part of the literature canon still. They've kind of put their foothold in and seem to have kind of stayed in the same place in a way. And maybe that's because there's not enough graphic novels, so to speak, to kind of, study. Because if you look at the ones that we're looking at, these are, kind of old by our standards in terms of, in some cases almost 20 years old, and Maus is, it was published, I think, almost 40 years at this point. Anyway, so the whole point here is that, and thank you for listening to this sort of diatribe about comic books, is to sort of say that, yes, comic books do have some value in literature, and that if you're thinking about, all the terms that we've gone over, they're there, right? Symbolism, characterization, theme, all that stuff is wrapped up in the comic books, and just a different way to experience it. And if you want some further reading, the TED Talk is really great this week. I would also recommend Scott McCloud's book about how to read comic books as well. That's a really fun book where he kind of gets into, the minutia of comic books. And in terms of other books, if you want to read, Maus, is a great, it's excellent. That's a good one to check out. Watchmen is something I would definitely recommend. It's sort of like the Beatles' White Album of comic books, I would say. It's like the thing, if you like comic books, you have to read it, right? If you like rock and roll, you have to listen to maybe more Abbey Road, I guess. Anyway, that's about it. And so, yeah, thank you so much for listening to this. If you have more comic book questions or questions about the course, as always, please ask me in the instructor area or just email me directly. All right, talk to you soon. Bye.